right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I've got a twofold show. So I'm going to be first playing my debate, Shroud Wars debate, with a new Shroud skeptic. Welcome to the Shroud Wars, Evil Christianity, aka Mike the Pilot. And he is a colossal Shroud skeptic on his channel, Evil Christianity. And we did a debate on the wax dating technique versus the carbon 14. So that's going to be the first half of this show, an hour and 20 minutes or so. And then I'm going to be doing a fan request show with G-Hawk because during that debate there was a technical glitch, at least a couple technical glitches, but I found out my slides weren't actually showing when I had it in full screen. It was just showing my slides in minimized mode and wasn't showing the actual slides that I was looking at in the full screen slideshow mode. So I responded G-Hawk, and he asked me as a fan request to refute the Godless Engineer, another Shroud skeptic. And so I watched, he has a 40-minute video. I watched the first 22 minutes of which covers wax and carbon 14. And so I used that as an opportunity to redo my presentation from the debate, but this time showing the actual slides for people. So in the second half, you will get to see the slides I prepared for the debate. Otherwise, you can go onto my blog and download the slides for free as you watch the debate proper and just follow along on those slides. Other than that, I do have a few fan request shows that I am going to work on. So Mark B asked me to look into Gog and Magog and Ezekiel 38. So it'll be a few weeks, but I'm going to try and do something on that. As well, another fan asked me to look at the Great Isaiah Scroll. So I'm not exactly sure what. I guess he just wants me to present on what it is. So I'll present on that. And then I had a new fan who's unfortunately said I sort of shook his faith. He's a Roman Catholic. He or she is a Roman Catholic and saw my shows on the Eucharistic miracles, and they sort of asked me to give it another look with the Solkoka miracle in Poland, but also a brand new Eucharistic miracle that I've never covered on my show that happened in India about 13 years ago with Jesus's image on the Eucharistic bread. And the Catholic Church has just ruled this to be a miracle just recently, a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago or whatever. So I promised him I would give it another objective, honest assessment, stuff like that. So I will be finishing off the solo fan request shows within the coming few weeks and stuff like that as soon as I get time. But yeah, other than that, let's get into the first part, my debate with Mike the Pilot, the Evil Christianity Shroud skeptic.
Boys and girls, welcome back to Evil Christianity. I have the pleasure of being joined with Dale from the Real Seeker Ministries. And you see his image here to the right of me. And he's had the pleasure of actually going to the place. Doesn't that look neat? And so he is with me actually live. And today we're going to have, Dale, say hello.
Hey guy, hey Mike, thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks, Dale. And he has brought a visual presentation that he's assembled, and we met on Derek's channel of Myth Vision. And my guess is we went back and forth for a while, and here we are in person. So Dale, just take a moment to introduce yourself, and then let me know when you want me to switch over to your presentation, and we'll get to it.
Yeah, sounds good. So yeah, we met on the Myth Vision comment boards. So James Tabor did a presentation on the Shroud of Turin, which is the topic of our debate here today. And we kind of engaged in the topics there. And yeah, you were kind enough to invite me on to do a discussion on the Shroud of Turin. So just a little bit about me. So yeah, my name's Dale. I'm the host of a podcast called Real Seekers. And I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years now, whereby I deal with various topics in the philosophy of religion, Christian apologetics, even in terms of the Shroud of Turin. I have a special series called the Shroud Wars, where I bring the experts from both sides on to actually do debates on the Shroud of Turin and stuff like that. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. And Dale and I have had enough fun together already. And by the way, we enjoy him here at the Evil Christianity channel, even though he is Canadian. So he is Canadian. And actually, I live in Alaska, and to this day, we still get people who wonder. When I first moved here, I was trying to transfer my phone number from Los Angeles to Alaska, and the woman at Verizon said, "No, we can only transfer within the United States." And I'm trying to remember now, but I had some other person relate that to me. So yeah, people don't get it. But yeah, we're way out here in Alaska, so we're actually kind of close to you, Dale. All right, so take it away, Dale, and let me know when you want me to switch over to your. Or might as well do it now. Do you want to go to your presentation?
Yep, I'm about to do that right now. So there you go.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, just let me know when it's up for people on the screen.
You are up, and it looks like you spent a lot of time preparing this.
But yeah, I'd say I spent maybe about 2 to 3 hours, kind of thing, preparing. So basically, the plan of action, we agreed to kind of like 10-minute or less openings, whatever we want to use, and then a couple 10-minute rebuttals. So Shroud Wars debate, Carbon 14 versus the Wax. So as part of my opening, I'm just going to be arguing the case for the Wax dating technique. So this is basically in the early 2010s, frustrated with the inability to do further carbon 14 dating. The Catholic Church won't allow any other further testing on the shroud itself. So a friend of mine named Giulio Fonte wanted to come up with different dating techniques to date the shroud. And basically, he came up with a list of about 7 to 10 scientific criteria in order to come up with a reliable, brand new dating technique used on linen cloths. And you can see here's the set of 7 criteria that he used in order to come up with his dating techniques. So, for example, he would have to obtain linen samples of known age from antiquity. He would screen the samples to ensure there were no irregularities. So, basically, he ensured the samples were, in fact, due to the natural aging process. He identified measurable age-dependent characteristics. He obtained measurements of these characteristics from all the suitable samples in order to help calibrate the formula he was using. He performed a statistical check. He assessed the level of uncertainty, and he determined any outlier effects due to the 1532 fire on the Shroud of Turin. So, using this, he's actually come up with 4 different physical dating tests, only the last of which we're going to be talking about here. But just so you know, there are 3 other tests, all of which date the shroud to the 1st century. So there's the FTIR spectroscopy dating, the Raman spectroscopy dating, and the mechanical tensile strength of the fibers. Again, these 3 are not the topic of debate, but I just want you to be aware that there are these, all of which date the shroud of the 1st century. Now, in terms of the dates that they obtained, so they got a combined date of 80 AD plus or minus 200 AD with a 95% degree of confidence. But the last of which, this is the topic, the wax dating technique. So essentially the history of this was invented in the year 2019 by Dr. Liberato De Caro, along with Giulio Fonte and other scientists. And they published the paper entitled X-ray Dating of Ancient Linen Fabrics. And this was published in a secular peer-reviewed science journal, Heritage. So basically, they used wide-angle X-ray scattering to irradiate a sample of linen with a beam of X-rays. And when you do this, it will produce a detectable scatter pattern with various intensity peaks. And it's these intensity peaks in particular which reveal the details of the crystalline structure present in it. And okay, so why is that important? Basically, it's from the intensity peaks of the crystalline structure that we can tell the age, because we know that the cellulose of linen becomes less and less crystalline over time in a reliable way. And Basically, this reduces the intensity peaks due to the depolymerization of the crystalline structure of the cellulose. So, again, this was published, nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin at all. This was published in 2019 in the Secular Science Journal, basically establishing that this technique can be used to date samples, and it was successful in dating various samples of known date. So basically, on this front, they used a theoretical calibration formula derived from the dating of linen samples. And basically, they said, look, this will work reliably in dating ancient linen samples if the following conditions are satisfied. So, number one, application is only to the threads of a textile no older than about 3,000 years old. So, if you date a fabric that's more than 3,000 years old, the technique's useless because by that point, it's degraded to the point where it can't degrade anymore. And the second is that the textiles, they use it on textiles whose cellulose degradation is mainly due to natural aging. And this is going to be the key, right? So they assumed in the paper an approximate or average room temperature and humidity conditions are assumed, kind of thing. So it wasn't more degraded by temperature or more degraded by humidity. That was the assumption in this paper. So, yeah, obviously the crystalline cellulose degradation process is dependent on the environmental factors such as temperature and humidity. Okay, so in 2022, April of 2022, we used this technique to date the Shroud of Turin, again by Dr. Liberato De Caro in a paper called X-ray Dating of a Turin Shroud's Linen Sample. And basically, the X-ray dating method was applied to this sample of the Turin Shroud along with control samples. And this sample did actually come from the same area as the 1988 carbon-14 dating sample. And it showed that based on the wax data profiles, they showed that actually the shroud is fully compatible with measurements obtained on a linen sample whose dating dates to about from 54 to 74 AD. It comes from the siege of Masada. So it's first century, the time of Jesus Christ. And tests on the effects of the thermal shock on the linen obtained by measuring these wax patterns before and after a thermal treatment in the oven, that's how they simulated the age, basically allowed for an increment in the natural aging due to the action of due to the accidental fires over the centuries. So that they did this as kind of a controlled test for if there's any fire damage over the centuries. As obviously we know, the Shroud of Turin was in a fire in 1532. But the point that I want to get here for the point of debate is that the shroud was consistent with the first century date, and it was inconsistent with a medieval date. So there are two aspects or two claims to this paper. So even if you don't believe the shroud dates back to the first century on this basis, it is absolutely proven beyond all reasonable doubt the shroud is centuries older than the medieval period. So that's what this paper shows happen. And again, it is assuming conditions of average temperatures 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius and a relative humidity of about 75 to 55% for the 13 centuries of its alleged unknown history. This is the visual of the dates. So these are the intensity peaks that are relevant to the aging or dating of the shroud. And as you can see, the sample orange is the Shroud of Turin, and it's pretty much exactly the same as the first century Masada sample. And this is key because this wasn't actually something that was based on calculations or making the assumptions and stuff like that. So this is the actual raw data from the wax profile itself. So this has no calculations or assumptions baked into the formula. This is what the instrument itself gives you, the raw data itself, proving it's first century. Okay, so just kind of moving on. The last thing I want to mention, so I kind of mentioned that there are these assumed temperature and humidity issues because these are things that will affect the wax dating of the Shroud of Turin and can throw it off. So yes, maybe we're getting a first century date, but that's an error because there's more damage due to it being subject to higher temperatures or more humidity, and that damaged the crystalline structure. Well, one thing that shroud skeptics never cite, I've never seen a single one of them even be aware of this, is that in September of 2022, another peer reviewed paper in the secular science journal Information was published called Long Term Temperature Effects the Natural Linen Aging of the Turin Shroud, where they no longer make these assumptions and they refine and calibrate their wax dating technique to account for specific monthly temperature and known monthly temperature and humidity aspects given four different proposed trajectories for where the shroud was during the first 13 centuries of its existence. So, for example, there are theories that say the shroud started out in Jerusalem in 30 AD and went to Beirut. And from there, from Beirut, it went to Constantinople, from Constantinople to Liry, France, where, the known history takes place. Other historians have shown evidence that actually it went from Jerusalem to Antioch, and then from Antioch to Constantinople onwards to Liry, France. The other major theory is the image of Edessa. So people say it went from Jerusalem to Edessa, from Edessa to Constantinople, and then onwards to France. So, but on the basis of these four historical avenues of where the shroud could have been for the first 13 centuries, they took into account those specific temperatures. And they actually showed that it's closest to the Jerusalem to Beirut or perhaps Jerusalem to Antioch hypotheses based on the monthly temperatures and that sort of thing. So they have given, they're not just relying on the average temperature of 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius. That is an outdated thing. We now have more refined and specific data regarding actual temperatures and actual humidity rates during its first 13 centuries on the basis of assuming, okay, one of these four paths would have been taken. So yeah, that's the end of my opening for the wax dating technique. And like I said, it proves it is consistent with the first century date, and it is totally inconsistent with the medieval date.
Woo! All right,
I should have
Dale.
practiced that. But yeah.
No, that was very well done, and it was very interesting to hear from a knowledgeable a defender of the shroud. So, and I took notes, but the problem with taking notes, you have to be able to read your own handwriting. All right, as you, so you mentioned, I want to kind of start at the back there, where you mentioned that there was a new peer-reviewed paper that was published. And if I recall correctly, it's from the journal Information. So one of the issues that I have with the, I hate to use this pejorative, maybe derisive term, shroudy, but for for the purposes of this debate, when I use the term shroudy, that'll mean those who believe that the linen, commonly known as the Holy Shroud of Turin, is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. So I'll just use the term shroudy. So one thing that I think the shroudies don't understand is not all science is equal. And so what'll happen is you'll have some bona fide, legitimate science published in the world's most prestigious peer-reviewed journals, such as the 1988 radiocarbon dating, right? It's published in Nature, which is probably the most prestigious journal in the world. And so what'll happen is there'll be science that'll challenge that. And it's important to note that all science is challenged. And that's a fundamental principle of the scientific process. So all science is challenged. So just because you have science as challenged doesn't mean it's debunked. So you see that all the time too. And it also underscores the importance of publishing. You've got to publish your papers so scientists can review your process and then try to replicate it and challenge it. Right? This is fundamental, but this is one of these disparities between the Shroudies and the non-Shroudies. Is the science is not equal, and I think it's largely from a fundamental lack of understanding of, or lack of a sophistication in understanding and evaluating science. Not that I'm attributing that to you specifically, Dale, but I see that out there all the time. But you did mention, you mentioned two journals today. One was from DeCaro's. He published, I think you characterized it as the secular journal Heritage. And then you also mentioned another one that's not often cited that was published in Information. All right. So both of those are part of these MDPI open access journals that are on this list of predatory journals where I can provide a link, and maybe we're getting a little off subject for this debate, but they have a known practice of accepting payments for lax reviews, and so trying to match up an MDPI publication with something from Nature, it's not equal. Anyway, you would probably want the science nonetheless, no matter how it got to the public domain, you would want it assessed on its merits. But the problem is DeCaro is using a system that he developed solely to date the Shroud. It's never been used ever before to date ancient Lenins, and in fact, it's not designed to. So I know the other side would argue, well, he had some controls to verify, but that's irrelevant because we don't know the history of the Shroud. And you mentioned like tensile strength, and I know you want to save this for a future debate. By the way, boys and girls, there will be future debates, I'm sure, about this. But like things like tensile strength, we know, one of the things we do know is that not only was the Shroud in a fire, right? There's fire and then there's heat. And the Shroud was encased in this fire and encased while it burned. And the fire was so hot that molten silver poured down through it and burned holes through it. And silver burns at something like, what is it, 1,500 Fahrenheit? Something, some super high temperature. So when we talk about natural degradation of linens and tensile strength of the fibers, we cannot make assumptions on what the history of this artifact is because we know it had been subjected to extreme heat. We can also be sure, we can also have confidence in those three radiocarbon dating tests. And by the way, for those who don't know, the reason the Catholic Church is hesitant, or I guess maybe outright refusing, I'm uncertain, to retest it is because the radiocarbon dating test is a destructive test. They would have to take scissors and snip out a piece, and they don't want to do that. And the Shroud activists, they would want something more to the center. And the Catholic Church considers this done. But I suspect, eventually we'll get something more. As I review my my notes here, we're going to talk about the wax system. How much time do I have, Dale?
I think you still got time. So I'll ask my clarifying question at the end.
Oh yeah.
You still got about like four minutes or so.
Oh, well, I think I'm basically done. What I was going to, just my final thought here is that we can have confidence that the three radiocarbon dating tests are accurate because, well, first of all, there's no science that has questioned the accuracy of it. There was science recently that questioned why there were two outliers. Excuse me. There were two outliers that were emitted from the formula. But even if we add those, it doesn't change the date range significantly. But we can have confidence that those tests were accurate because it lines up with when the church when the shroud first appeared, and the church actually spoke to and interviewed the artist who confessed or admitted that he made it. And it also lines up with when that unique and advanced weave that the Shroud of Turin is made with, this four head loom. And we're getting off to another subject, but that wasn't even invented until that time. And we also know that the style that it was painted in is Gothic. It has Gothic features. And I think that hits it all, Dale. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay. So just so I understand, because I thought it was going to be like 2 10-minute openings. So I do the wax, you do carbon 14, then I would do a rebuttal to the carbon 14, and you would rebut wax. But I think you mostly gave your rebuttal to wax there for the most part. Is that so? Like, do you want me to respond to that or go on
Yes.
carbon 14 or?
For those who want some background on how the Evil Christianity office works, Dale sent me an email this morning. It woke me. I was like, "Oh my God, it's today the day." You're right.
Gotcha. Okay, so I'll just respond to, I guess, all your opening case there, kind of thing. Okay, so in terms of wax, let me start there. So you made four claims against the wax thing, right? So the first is not all science is legitimate, and of course that's of course true, even in peer-reviewed science journals like Nature. That sometimes that's the case, right? So just because something's peer-reviewed doesn't mean it's good science. So I totally agree with that point. The question is, okay, this was published in a peer-reviewed journal and that sort of thing. Um, it was reviewed by scientists and was qualified to be published. That said, on your second claim, you claim, yeah, but the journals are known as predatory. And to that, I just look, I'm here for truth. That is true. The journals don't have the best reputation, kind of thing. But what I would say is exactly what you said. It doesn't matter. The science of the paper is good, right? Again, we got to judge it on that basis. And on that front, I didn't hear any objection. Well, okay, so your objection was, well, look, this is clearly biased because it was developed directly to date the shroud. But I prove that's not actually the case because the first technique had not the first paper published in 2019 had nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin at all. It was dating about a dozen samples of known age, and guess what? This method just happened to get the right dates and that sort of thing. So clearly there's something to it. So it, and that was published in November of 2019. Nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin at all. So there's that. And the 1532 fire, you said, okay, so this was the substantive objection saying that, well, the technique can't be relied upon because it was in this conditions with immense temperatures that melted the silver and led to those burn holes. So I would just want to say that's not an object because the paper itself in April of 2022 accounts for that. And they proved that even if you say these temperatures, it was subject to these temperatures, it would not have had the effect on the Shroud of Turin's crystalline nature of the cellulose. It would only affect it by 0.6% or something like that. Now, the way they got that is they're assuming it wasn't privy to temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius. Is that just an assumption? No, that's based on empirical, peer reviewed data. So there's Dr. Ray Rogers and Sturp's findings that prove this, right? So Dr. Ray Rogers did his investigation, that's included in the paper, and shows that, yeah, if it were subject to temperatures in excess of 200 degrees, first of all, it would have depolymerized to the point where we would not see images today. It's impossible for it to have been subject to such high temperatures at that point, directly, kind of thing, right? The second is if it were subject directly to such temperatures as you said, 1500 degrees Celsius, that would result in a hot scorch, and that would show up under ultraviolet fluorescence as bright red. Which, guess what? The areas of the shroud that were subject, where the silver molten hit the cloth and melted through, they fluoresce bright red because they are hot scorches. They were subject to these hot temperatures. So we basically know for empirically that it wasn't subject to any temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius. And just to back this up, I'm not going to quote. Forget the pro shroud guys. They're all biased shroudies, as you call them, and stuff like that. Let me quote your good buddy, the one that you rely on to say that there's paint, Dr. Walter McCrone, who's siding with me on this issue and says, no, that the shroud was not subject to hot temperatures, because he knows that if it were, then painting would have been disproven immediately, because that would alter the chemistry of the paint on the shroud. So his excuse is, oh, but the shroud was folded up into 48 layers and it was insulated from these hot temperatures, and that's why there aren't. Well, if that's true, if I'm going to assume with the skeptic that that's true, then we wouldn't have this problem, and it doesn't disprove the wax. So that's it for the wax stuff. You did mention carbon 14. Do you want me to give my rebuttal for that, or?
Yeah, let me just jump in here quick, and yeah, we can kind of make this up as we go along, because we're both the purpose here is truth. And another thing I just want to take a moment to acknowledge is that the advocates for the shroud, those who believe that it's authentic, this is not coming out of nowhere, right? So I I fully acknowledge. They can point to this and they can point to that, and I get it. And so it in that sense, it does make it, whether you're interested in it or not, it makes it kind of fascinating to just watch all this, evolve. But yeah, both sides can point to something to support their arguments. Okay, so one of the scientists that you pointed to was Dr. Ray Rogers. So he, at the risk of smearing the man instead of his science, I just want to point out that on the Wikipedia page of shroud or fringe theories on the shroud, he's got quite a contribution to that page. He's got this biocontamination theory and this plasma discharge theory, and the Maillard reaction hypothesis, and the vanillin loss theory, and so he was one of these scientifically gifted people who was also a deep believer in Christianity and in the authenticity of the shroud, and he was just cranking out papers, and a lot of this is just complete nonsense. But regarding the burning and this dye that was on there, he produced his, I think it was his last paper. He died, I think, soon after in 2005, and he suggested that these fibers. By the way, he also produced some science with some fibers that we have an unknown provenance about. So that's another issue. But assuming he's got actual shroud fibers, he was asserting that they were coated with some kind of madder root dye, and that because the linen does not accept the dye, that any coating would be loosely adhered to this fabric. Anyway, his paper that was produced, published in 2005, has been falsified. So, in other words, some of the assertions that he made about, for example, this coating on it, it was actually observed by McCrone. And for those who don't know, we're throwing around these names like they're our family. So, because those who are interested in the shroud, as we both are, Dale, we know all these people, right, and their history and everything. So McCrone. So basically, what we have here is STURP, which is this. Oh, and you mentioned STURP too. So STURP is the Shroud Turin Research Project, and this was this team that was put together in the 70s. And McCrone was originally a member of it until he resigned in 1980. But STURP never published any peer-reviewed science. That's important to keep in mind too. I see some of these shroudies out there talk about, they have, 7,000 pounds of equipment or whatever. Well, they never produced any actual science. So the science here that I rely on is, and you mentioned this earlier, Dale, that is this 1988 these radiocarbon C14, we'll call it, dating tests, and that the authors themselves termed to be conclusive. And then we got years later, we've got Walter McCrone, who discovered that the red stains were actually a red ochre pigment, because dried blood is always black. And I'm sure Dale will discuss this in the future too, but the argument from the pro-shroud side would be, well, it lost its color and it didn't have any potassium in it because if you get tortured enough, it changes the biochemistry. But I'm going off on a tangent. Why don't you save me here, Dale?
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so yeah, I'm trying to focus in on like the wax and then the carbon 14. So you did mention the carbon 14 thing. I think, are you kind of like agreed on the wax stuff before I move on to address the carbon 14, or
Well,
there is one last thing I'll say on the wax, because so again, we need to be truthful. So your second point is good. I don't think it invalidates the wax dating technique and the studies that have been done, but it is in a predatory journal and that sort of thing, as people would qualify it and stuff. So like that's something that's a note of caution, but and says, okay, look in, is this good science or not? And I'm arguing it is good science when you actually look into it. The other thing is Dr. Liberato De Caro, the main author of these papers. So I don't know if you've looked into his background, because he's not just a shroudie. He's a world's expert that has spent. I have him quoted in one of my slides. Let me see what he says in his own words here, just so I. Okay, so yeah, De Caro is a loon. Those were your words in one of your shows there, but. So De Caro, he's got over 30 years of direct experience in the research field of X-ray scattering and electron diffraction. This is why he gets paid the big bucks. This is what he's done. Nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin or anything like that. He's become involved in it since this discovery and stuff like that. But before that, if you take a look at, he's got literally hundreds of research papers from the top science journals in the world. And if you want, I can show that includes multiple publications with this wax technique in the journal Nature, which you said is the top journal. He's got dozens published in the journal Nature, in X-ray calligraphy. I don't know if you want me to show that or if my word's good enough, but I'm looking at right now Applied Crystallography, which is probably the top journal in this specific research field. So not just science generally, but when it comes to like wax and understanding crystallography studies and stuff like that. Applied Crystallography is probably the top journal. There's Biological Crystallography Journal, Nature Nanotechnology. So this guy's immensely well published. Yeah, let me know. Do you need to see that, or should I post it somewhere? The link.
Yeah, if you want to after, Dale, if you have links, send them to me and I will post them in my notes. But I do have your side active if you just wanted to turn it active, if you had something to show.
Okay, yeah. Hang on 1 second. Sharing screen. So here's the list of all Liberato De Caro's publications. Nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin, just all X-ray microimaging laboratory, stuff like that. These are just 20 of them. So you can see all applied crystallography. I'm trying to find the nature one for you guys, but there are multiple right there, right at the top. Non-destructive determination. So yeah, he's got publications in the top secular science journals. He's not just a Shroudy or a Loon or something like that. So that's all I wanted to point out there.
Yeah, that's fair. I appreciate it, and I would argue also that there is a YouTube comments voice and a evil Christianity debate voice.
Oh yeah.
But no, your point's fair. If I can just take a moment and follow up on this, I did buy a paper yesterday that you might enjoy. And so if you go to evilchristianity.com, I hate to plug myself here on a debate with you, but I do have some resources here, and one that I just bought yesterday. And it's called, so it's a new one. It was just recently published, and it was actually, and I guess I'm a little embarrassed to say, I was reading the Daily Mail, and I saw that, and thought, that's interesting. So I read it, and it is interesting. And the author here notes that, by the way, the point of that is, you know what, I will save that for our next debate. But I do encourage you again to look at it. He notes here, when we're talking about this wide angle scattering, I just want to note here, when we make these broad assertions about the conditions it was in and the tensile strength and the what coating is on it or whatever you want to assign to this, this is all from a single thread that measured 0.5 millimeter by 1 millimeter. So this is what this is coming from, just so we can frame this properly. And also, you mentioned that the science of wax is good, as you said. So De Caro himself in this paper, in this 2022 paper, uses the word experimental to describe this 21 times. So what does he says? He calls it, give me a moment here. He calls it an experimental data, experimental analysis, experimental results, experimental quantities, experimental evaluation, experimental setup. So he's acknowledging that this is experimental, right? I think we can agree on that. It's and I know that you will point to that he used controls, but he has to make some assumptions. And so he's assuming basically it was room temperature. That is his assumption, that it was room temperature for 2,000 years, I guess would be from his point of view. So it's just a ludicrous assumption, particularly since we know that it had received heat hot enough to melt silver. And we should also, as you mentioned, his scientific work. I mean, he has had a paper retracted, right? He threw out this idea of these. He found some blood on it, and the editorial board had to retract it, and they actually cited bad science for it. So he's not perfect, and he's an advocate. I think you would acknowledge that I think most of these recent shroud scientists are devoutly Catholic. Now that shouldn't it sounds like a smear because science is science, but we got people who are advocating for a particular result, such as De Caro. In other words, when in his technique, with his this wax technique that he invented, you can plug in whatever numbers you want. And what do you know? How much you want to bet he was up late at night plugging in different numbers until he got 2,000?
Okay. Okay. So in terms of the 2017 paper, if you go to that website, yes, it does say it's retracted. So my first question is, okay, so what, right? That's totally irrelevant to the debate topic in terms of whether or not the Wax's dating technique works or not, because the study involved wax wasn't to do with dating. It was about identifying this blood type thing, right? And so even if everything you want to say as a skeptic is correct about this 2017 paper, that in no way condemns the wax dating of the Shroud of Turin in the later papers. And just to quote, in Dr. DeCaro's own words, I asked him directly to respond to this charge. He says, quote unquote, let us also note that the 2017 paper contains no X-ray dating of any shroud sample because the theory of this new dating method was developed in 2019, so 2 years later, and applied to the Shroud of Turin sample only later and published in 2 articles of 2022. Now, here's him responding to the reasons for the retraction. Because if you read the actual reasons for the retraction, it's clear the editor of the journal had no clue what he was talking about, and he was just being biased. Because, so here, Dr. DeCaro in his own words. So, for example, one of the reasons for the retraction was about the sample, right? So the sample analyzed in our work was only one from the beginning, before the peer review process even took place. So the journal editor knew this from the beginning. For the 3 reviewers and the editor, before the peer review process began, and this was not a problem. They published it. They didn't care. So why did the editor only realize this after the publication of the work? This is very strange and hints at bias. It seems to me rather that we are faced with a case of scientific ostracism. The second and last point on the retraction is actually it's not retracted. Despite what the journal says, it didn't follow the proper scientific protocol or procedure for the journal to retract the paper, because not only did the journal editors hide the response, if you go under the paper where it's retracted and then click on the comment section, you'll see Dr. DeCaro and Giulio Fonte's response to the reasons for the retraction. So this is against the procedure. It should be on the front page. They hid it in the comment section. But not only did they hide their Dr. DeCaro's response to the retraction on the comments page, but the editors of this journal violated the peer review process rules and etiquette of proper scientific peer review process by Dr. DeCaro says it this way. Please note that +1 editor's answer to a reply to the retraction is still missing and on the comments page, and we are still waiting for the reply. So the editors have to reply to Dr. DeCaro if he responds to the reasons of retraction. As of right now, they've responded to the reasons for retraction and refuted them, and the editors of +1 have not responded back. So as per the rules of peer review, that means technically speaking, it's not retracting, despite what's on their front page. That's Dr. DeCaro's response to that.
Well, if DeCaro is certain that his science, and again, what we're talking about is this the blood that he found, claimed to have found. By the way, no blood has ever been found on the shroud, just to put that out there. But if he's so confident in his science, there are other journals that he can publish in.
Yeah, fair enough. You can submit it to other journals and stuff, and there is blood on the shroud. We'll save that for another day. Wax versus carbon 14. Well, let me give my response to the. Again, you just kind of mentioned the carbon 14. So I have a rebuttal based on what I again, I'm going to be responding to stuff outside what you've mentioned here, just because.
Please do. It was my mistake, and I don't know a whole lot about it actually. So educate us and rebut my non assertion.
Absolutely. Okay. Journal Heritage. Okay, so my 1988 carbon 14. So essentially, basically, skeptics will claim, as Mike has done, right, or Evil Christianity has done, the carbon 14 gives a medieval date, right? Didn't they date it? And they got between 1260 to 1390 AD with a claimed 95% degree of confidence. And that 95% is crucial. If it's less than 95%, you throw the results in the garbage. That's just an international statistics standard when you're using things like a chi-square test, which is the statistical test they used. Now, by way of rebuttal, I intend to provide 2 to 3 undercutting defeaters and 1 rebutting defeater. So what does that philosophical jargon mean? So undercutting defeaters, basically, I don't have a burden of proof. I'm just saying, well, what if this happened? Or what if that happened? Can you, as the skeptic making a claim, disprove that these scenarios are equally probable? So your burden of proof basically is saying you have to prove that they are improbable to be true. I just have to say what if kind of thing. And the reason why I don't have a burden of proof is because undercutting defeaters are aiming to undercut your warrant, your justification for believing something. Now, on the rebutting defeater end, I as the pro show guy, I have a burden of proof of my own here, because this is basically rebutting on the basis of fact. So I have some kind of defeater that I can say I can prove as being probably factual, which refutes the carbon 14. So with the rebutting defeater, both of us have a burden of proof on that front. So hopefully that makes sense as to what the difference is there. So my first undercutting defeater, so I promised Mike that I would include a couple things for him to respond to. So the first is, okay, what if a conspiracy or a fraud happened? Again, it's up to the skeptic to prove that this didn't happen or probably didn't happen. But there are some reasons for doubt here, reasonable doubt here, because look, contrary to proper science and just plain old common sense, there were certain scientific protocols established for any and all carbon 14 datings, and they just violated them. And including specifically with respect to the Turin shroud, it was called the Turin Protocols, agreed to by all of the labs back in 1986, prior to doing the actual dating. They didn't follow these. These guys, this is not science. Not all science is legit. This was horrible. So in the first place, Cardinal Rigi was brought in to do the cutting of the sample. He had no expertise in textiles whatsoever. He was just a novice churchman. Rigi was also given the responsibility for the videotaping of the proceedings. Now, this was a conflict of interest, and he used this to greedily get money, because he would later treat this video as his own personal property, and he charged the BBC quite the hefty sum just to, produce some of it as a documentary. But here's a couple of the specific protocols that I want to say. So Michael Tite, he was one of the leaders. He was at the British Museum. He's the guy that emphatically made the statement, the shroud's a fake. It dates to 1260 to 1390. And unfortunately, it was all supposed to be videotaped, but he took the samples to a private area, just him and another person. And he took the samples backstage. Now, this gave rise to the conspiracy theory. Oh, they obviously switched out the samples. They fudged the data. They brought in a unknown medieval sample, and that's what they dated. They never actually dated the Shroud of Turin. And this was all off camera. In fact, I have quotes from Michael Tite admitting that this was quite a stupid thing on his part, and it led to this conspiracy theory. Worse yet, carbon 14, we were supposed to have blind testing. It was supposed to be a blind test. It wasn't. They labeled each of the things. The labs knew in advance what all the samples were in advance. A major procedural blunder. No wonder they got the control samples they got right, because they knew what they were dating. It could have been fudged for all we know, right? And in a letter to the editor of the journal Nature, this is the journal that published it, a reader asked about these changes in the protocols. Michael Tite responded by saying, well, the labeling of the samples was irrelevant because the unusual weaving of the shroud, it would have been identifiable anyway. So there was no point in doing it. Well, then don't agree to do blind testing, and then don't do it. So that was his excuse for saying why there wasn't a blind test done. And you could ask, well, who is he to make this? He's a bioshroud skeptic. Who is he to make that judgment?
If I can jump in here, Dale, I'm sorry to do this to you, but that was impactful to me that the blind test was abandoned. So because we live in the internet age, I fact checked you as you were speaking. Mm-hmm. So you're correct. And so the blind test here from Wiki was that it was abandoned because the distinctive 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave of the shroud could still be matched in the controls, right? So even if they had, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump that in. So you was correct that they did know what it was from the samples.
And that was Michael Tite's. that was why Michael Tite, when reporters were saying, like, why did you do this? I thought it was agreed. The protocol was for blind testing. Why? He's like, oh, well, it wouldn't have mattered anyways. They could have told what the shroud was or something like that. That was Michael Tite's excuse and or reason, depending on your perspective. But either way, that's not good science, like if you're not doing blind testing and stuff. Also, what do you make, before I move on from this thing then, like, what do you make of the fact that they brought it off camera against the protocols into a secret room and then brought out the samples in the vials for the testing? How would you disprove that they switched the samples?
Yeah, you know what? I trust that is correct. Could somebody? So I see this on these comment threads, by the way, and also we're here at about the 1 hour mark, so we should probably work on concluding this, and then I'm eager for the next one. But I see these theories out there that there were demonic forces behind this, and all kinds of bad things could have happened to the. They could have switched it out or whatever. I don't know. That's getting in so deep that my brain kind of turns off, to be honest. I don't believe that anybody, I believe all the scientists who were there, all the science that was conducted were by earnest scientists who were genuinely seeking truth, who had an intellectual curiosity and performed the science at a professional level. So if somebody wants to look at that from the opposite point of view, you know what? Then I guess all things are possible. If people want to believe,
equally probable then in your is it just a blind faith on your part, like, or is it equally probable? Or are you saying it's improbable though? Even if it's possible, it's improbable.
Well, we say blind faith. I believe I believe these scientists did not have an agenda. They may not have been Christian. They may have been. And of course, a lot of Christians don't believe in the authenticity of the shroud. But I believe that the testing was done properly and correctly, and we have accurate results. But I understand that if there's a little slip in the chain of custody somewhere, someone goes off stage for a moment and then returns, there are going to be people who are going to fill in the blanks. I also enjoy debating the moon landing conspiracists too. But I do believe, now you're right. I can't prove that whoever was off camera with these samples didn't switch it into something else.
Okay. And just to help you out, because I don't believe this myself. I think that this is very improbable. Now, what's my basis? What's my reason? It's not just I don't trust these guys. They are horribly biased against the Shroud. You know, if you're going to dismiss Shroudies, I'm going to dismiss anti-Shroudies because these guys in their book are horribly biased before dating the Shroud. They were not intellectually curious people. They had an agenda, and that's proven. But even still, I don't think this conspiracy theory is true. And it's because a pro Shroud guy who knew Michael Tite, Ian Wilson, vouched for him, at least to the extent that he would not do this deliberate fraud, basically, kind of thing. And on the basis that even pro Shroud people who know him personally are vouching for him, that's my reason for going, okay, I don't think this is the answer. But still, we can't just make blind assumptions and assume in their favor, is what I'm saying on either side. Okay.
Yeah, and I get it. Like I said, the pro Shroud advocates can point to stuff. It's just not just made up. So I cannot prove that that any period of time that the Shroud was left, unmonitored, unguarded, that somebody could have done something nefarious. I'll assume that there are people who were anti-Christian and wanted the Shroud to be dated in the medieval times. I can't prove that none of them weren't alone and did something nefarious. I can't prove that.
Okay. Fair enough. So the second objection, this is another one. It's basically saying that the AMS carbon-14 dating itself was unreliable at the time for dating textiles like the Shroud. And on that front, there were actual tests published in secular radiocarbon journal, the top for carbon-14. That's the top journal in the world, published, right, where there were certain intercomparison tests. So, for example, one was they tested 4 AMS labs. The name of the paper is An Intercomparison of Some AMS and Small Gas Counter Laboratories by Richard Burleigh, published in 1986, so before the Shroud was dated. And the results were found to be inconsistent with the historically derived date of the known samples. It was a Peruvian sample dating to 1200 AD, a known sample. And they got that wrong, consistently wrong, across all 4 of the labs. And that's exactly what happened with the Shroud, according to the pro Shroud guys. So it's possible that even though there are independent labs, they all get the date wrong, but they get it wrong consistently. So that's what that peer-reviewed study proved. Another intercomparison test in the so-called report on stage 3 of the International Collaborative Program, it was published in 1990, just after the Shroud was dated. And they showed that each lab was judged against 3 basic criteria, and they were given a pass-fail. Now, they showed that 2 out of the 5 AMS labs failed the systematic bias criterion. Now, the systematic bias criterion is very important when I get to my next point. But look, it's only a 60% of them got past all 3 of these criteria. That's really horrible. And that caused the leader, carbon-14 scientist, nothing to do with the Shroud, not a Christian or a Shroudie, but Dr. Murdoch Baxter, director of the Scottish University's Research and Reactor Center, he said this: the margin of error with AMS carbon-14 dating seems to be as much as 2 to 3 times as great as practitioners of the technique have claimed. Of the 38 labs investigated, only 7 produced results that the organizers of the trial considered to be satisfactory. It is now clear that other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analyzing of the samples. The AMS labs in particular, those are the labs that dated the Shroud of Turin, were way out, even when dating samples as little as 200 years old. And to save time, I've got other quotes as well from 2004, and even from Dr. Christopher Ramsey in 2008. He's the head of the Oxford Radio, or was the head of the Oxford Radiocarbon Laboratory, one of the labs that dated the Shroud. And even he was causing doubts about these. So that's my next point. I'll let you come back before I move on. The general unreliability of this technique. at the time. Anything
Yeah,
you
no,
say?
I that you can find quotes or bad science in the world. I get it, and of course, you would say it's not a few specific instances. These were samples. These were representative samples of labs who didn't meet up to the standards. I get it. My response would be I just don't believe it. I have confidence that those 1988 radiocarbon dating tests were accurate and was good science. And even with the two outliers that were thrown out to reach that 95% confidence level, even if you add in those two, it doesn't change anything.
Okay. Okay. I guess just okay. So one last question on this, and then I'll move on to that point, kind of thing. But if or when you say you just don't believe it, like if these studies actually say what I'm saying they're saying about the AMS labs and stuff, what and you confirm with your own eyes, because I can provide you the link for free to read these papers. Would that be a problem for you, or would you still say, well, whatever those problems were has nothing to do with dating the shroud? That was proper and good.
That one.
Okay, fair enough. Cool. All right. So the I'm not going to do this one just to save time, but so fudged statistics, right? So basically, you alluded to this. Now you say it's two. It was actually four. There were 16 subsamples. They only published 12, kind of thing, right? So in 2017, in the peer review, there are a total of 6 peer-reviewed science journals, including the 2017 paper by Tristan Casabianca, who had to sue the British Museum under the Freedom of Information Act in order to get access to the raw data from the British Museum. And it was discovered there through the statistical analysis that they basically fudged the data in the journal Nature. And this was known about at the time. We have quotes. I wish I included it here, but from one of the carbon 14 scientists, the peer reviewer, saying, don't publish that you have a 95% degree of confidence. That is not science. And the journal Nature said, we'll do it anyways. That's essentially what they did. They knew in advance about this problem and didn't care. And it looks, I don't have proof because I can't go into their motivations, but it looks like they tried to hide the raw data as long as they could, even requiring Tristan Casabianca to take legal action to get these results and then figure this out. But here's the thing with the carbon 14 dating. So it's not, Mike is absolutely correct. Again, in the interest of truth, he's right that even if we include all of these 4 outliers, as he calls them, look, it ranges from like 1100 to 1400. It's a bit of a wider range. It's not 1260 to 1390, but it's all within the medieval period. It's not like we got some dates that are putting it in the 1st century. So that's true in terms of the range. But with respect to the statistical standard of the 95% degree of confidence, that's irrelevant. What matters is the slope or the gradient of all of these 16 subsamples. And on that front, we proved there is a slope of 36 years per centimeter. So the shroud carbon 14 dates younger, starting from the edge of the cloth, 36 years younger for every centimeter of cloth you move in towards the middle. Now, you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, that is significantly, statistically significant, because in order to be valid, it has to have that 95% degree of confidence within 2 sigma levels. But with the Shroud of Turin, the dates obtained are actually close to 3. So that's like 66% degree of confidence. Not good enough. That means we have no reason to think that the shroud actually dates, in terms of its actual calendar age, is actually consistent with the carbon 14 dates obtained. And in fact,
Well,
we have a 98.6.
if you're referring to that Casabianca paper, right?
Yes, and there are 5 others that say the same thing.
Well, but okay. Well, at least he's stating here that he's saying that they're talking about the homogeneity, whether it's all the same, right? That's what you're talking about. As you move closer to the center, and we can only go so far, right? We have a very small sample. So he's saying here that from his paper, he's saying that the medieval hypothesis of the age of the tested sample should not be ruled out based on his test. So just to make that clear, he's just advocating for more tests.
Yeah, so that's what this point. So basically, they've calculated there is a 98.6% probability based on the carbon-14, all 16 subsamples, and the gradient, the slope, that there was a systematic error. Remember, I used that word when I was quoting it above. There's a systematic error, not the assumed measurement error that the journal Nature published back in 1989. It's a systematic error, which just means it's linear, it's directional, right? Like the error is going in a clear direction. It's
I know,
not just
but we
random.
have such a.
But so here's the part what is causing that systematic error is the question. And on that front, you're quite correct that Tristan and many other scientists go, well, we just don't know what is causing the systematic error. There are different options. So there's a natural option that maybe one of the labs just sucked at cleaning the samples and missed. There was some residue contamination still on that sample, and this is what's causing these outliers. There's another equally probable at this point option of neutron irradiation. Maybe there's a contamination from a supernatural resurrection that caused neutrons to influence the results and made a 30 AD cloth date to the medieval data. These hypotheses are both empirically equivalent at this, whether you have philosophical objections or want to rule one out on that front.
Okay, so you're referring to Rucker's paper?
Correct. These are empirically equivalent. And,
right. So he is a loon. So he has no published science, right? He has his own website that he publishes his own papers to. And you know what? We're going to have to maybe save this for another day. But he only cites. So this paper that I referred to you earlier that just came out, he refers to these bad practices, including self-citation, and that's what Rucker does.
Okay. So in terms of the peer, you're right. He does not have any official peer review. I would argue he has better though, because he has unofficial peer review, which unlike the peer review in professional journals, he actually publishes who are the reviewers, who's actually reviewing this. And you can see it's people like Brian Walsh and stuff like that, like world famous statisticians.
I know, but to use so if you're going to accept his neutron absorption theory, then he's assuming that a resurrection event occurred. And then he's assuming that when bodies resurrect, they emit neutrons. That is well,
you're correct.
Yeah, and it's something outside of this debate that I would mock heavily.
Okay, well, let me ask this last final thing then, because I know you want to wrap up. But so remember I said at this point they're empirically equivalent, right? We can't prove Bob's theory is true about neutron irradiation or maybe some other kind of contamination unknown that somehow is throwing off these results, but it's still medieval. I would say we've actually found now empirical proof published in the secular peer-reviewed journal Applied Optics, not a puff piece. This is on the level of the journal Nature or something like that, right? Applied Optics is a good journal by a physicist, Dr. Tom McAvoy. And he's actually taken the ultraviolet fluorescence studies independently, right? They were done by Stirk back in 1978, the ultraviolet fluorescence spectral tests. And the findings from that test precisely match, here's a picture of it, Bob Rucker's assumed MCNP computer calculations. Again, he assumed the resurrection happened and burst of neutrons. These were the results of his MCNP computer calculations. Totally independently, the ultraviolet published in peer review match that curve. Would you agree that's empirical confirmation, that seems to suggest, yeah, actually we should believe Bob's hypothesis is true. It was irradiated by neutrons. What's your thoughts on that?
I cannot get my brain to go down that path. Yeah, and this is maybe what separates the religious from the non-religious. It's not something I can even begin to consider.
Is that for philosophical reasons, or like based on the science?
Well,
Like,
based on every based on every observation, every known law of physics and common sense, that a body cannot die and then become undead after 3 days of being dead. And then even if that happened once, the mechanism of action is unknown.
Okay, I can work with that, because again, I don't want to take over your show, but can I respond to that? Or
I would love for you to take over the show, but I'm afraid I've enjoyed this, and you're passionate and you're extraordinarily well informed. But we're over an hour into this. We're going to do more, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
I really enjoyed.
I got no problem with you giving your unfiltered arguments, and it's fascinating to hear. And I'm a little rinky-dink channel here, and I feel like I'm having a world-class shroud expert on. So I enjoy the access. I'm just afraid this is too much. I mean, my brain's already going, this is too much for just the casual shroud enthusiast.
Gotcha. I'll keep it more popular level next time.
No, this is perfectly fine, and I'm becoming educated here too. And you're actually having correspondence and communications with these actual scientists, so it's fascinating. But I'm just worried we're going too long, and I've got a wife who needs coffee and a dog who needs to run into the lake. So
sounds good.
You know what? I'll give my standard sign off. Don't go anywhere, Dale. I'll be back with you, and we'll just close it here, and we'll do more. And but you go into such depth that we need to make. We need to narrow our focus some. When we talk about just the shroud and the dating, you could go on at some of these really niche topics, such as rocket. So we'll do that next time. But anyway, this is you've been an extraordinary guest, and I appreciate your knowledge and your advocacy of the shroud, because it's fascinating. I know they're all out there. And a lot of them are not knowledgeable, but it's always fascinating to encounter someone who knows this in great detail. And you have the breadth of your knowledge is so great too. We can switch from topic to topic, and you can just name drop and paper drop, and all this backwards and forwards. So it was an extraordinary experience. So I've got a lot to think about for our next one. So with that, awesome. It's been a pleasure, Dale, and we'll link to you. And of course, you can chop up this for any way you want for a presentation on your channel. The good luck to with or blessings, I should say, for your ministry there. I know you're doing good work, and we're all trying to do the right thing here, right? So with that, boys and girls, don't be evil. Don't do it. It's bad. Cue the outro.
What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on how wrong Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is about the Shroud of Turin. We will...
All right, so yeah, this is going to be kind of a straightforward reaction style, reacting in real time to the video as I watch it and that sort of thing, specifically focusing in on his parts about the Shroud of Turin and Dr. Jeremiah Johnston's points related to that. So this is for the fan G-Hawk, who made this request that I go through this video. So let's do it.
Perhaps no religious artifact on planet Earth creates as much fascination and controversy as the Shroud of Turin. Is this the real burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, an expert on the shroud, believes the evidence for it is now beyond all doubt. So, my friend, that is a huge statement. Why do you believe that?
Well, it's great to be with you, Raj, on CBN News. I believe that based on the evidence, 102 scientific disciplines have spent over 600,000 hours of scientific study on the Shroud of Turin. And the great majority of them have concluded the shroud is indeed 2,000 years old.
First off, simply just listing 102 disciplines that have studied the Shroud of Turin in a vague way tells us literally nothing. We don't know if any of these disciplines have any relevance to studying an artifact like the shroud. It's a classic apologist tactic to vaguely reference the evidence and then just appeal to large numbers in order to convince their audience.
Yeah, well, don't. Joe Marino is the one who's meticulously cataloged all of these academic disciplines and published it for free on a paper on academia.edu. I highly suggest that you educate yourself, and instead of making skeptical assumptions from stupidity, maybe use your brain and think for a change. Think and go and look at the list of disciplines and see if they're relevant or not, because they are. Come on, skeptic, you're off to a bad start.
We can only accurately date the shroud back to 1354 France. And even then, it was denounced by a local bishop as a forgery.
Typical skeptic, ignorant as heck, making his claims from supernatural skeptical stupidity syndrome, obviously Satan-induced. So we can only accurately, says who? Says you're biased skeptics? No, nobody believes that. We can accurately date it back all the way back to the 1st century in the book of Galatians, actually. So he's just wrong there. Totally clueless, of course, as usual. And then he makes this vague mention to the Darcy Memorandum. Oh, man, I'm so tired of refuting that. Name a single PhD historian who believes that. It's a fraud, a proven fraud. Godless Engineer, you got to do better. You got to educate yourself before you speak. You have no clue what you're talking about. Darcy Memorandum is a proven fraud. We don't even know what the Darcy Memorandum even said in the first place, because our manuscripts date from the 1800s and they contradict each other. So we don't even know what the original Latin said for the document. Secondly, it's not signed or dated, meaning it was never sent or even perhaps even read by Bishop Darcy himself. It looks like it was signed by the scribe that wrote it out. And then he realized, this is complete horse trash. I'm lying and I'm going to damn my soul to hell by sinning in this way. So I'm just going to throw this in the garbage and never send it. That's what actual PhD historians, and even the ultimate shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry himself, admits happened. And he says this Darcy Memorandum evidence is garbage and rubbish. Only a fool could appeal to this as evidence that the shroud is medieval. But just to counter you very quickly here, Godless Engineer, to educate you, because you do mention the good Bishop Darcy's predecessor, Bishop Henry de Poitiers, the one who actually conducted the inquiry, allegedly. And we have a letter from him dated to 1356 saying, guess what? The exact opposite. He likes the shroud. He says, keep doing it. I ratify, affirm, and love the divine cult of showing the Shroud of Turin to the people. Keep up the good work, Cleary Church. So contradicts the guy from 40 years later claiming that he held an inquiry and an artist confessed and all this stuff. But of course, Godless Engineer, as a typical Fundy Shroud skeptic, is totally ignorant of what the actual PhD historians and historical documents from the period actually say.
If that wasn't problematic enough, the 1988 radiocarbon study that was done by 3 independent labs actually dated the shroud to between 1260 and 1390 CE, which matches up to when the shroud first entered the historical record.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't match up with Robert de Clary in 1203 mentioning the Shroud of Turin, for example. That's before 1260, so total mismatch. Geez, these skeptics begging the question. It's all they've got. But as for the 3 carbon-14 dating, a total hoax. 6 peer-reviewed journals have totally and utterly refuted it. It is garbage and bunk. Only a fool would believe that the shroud is actually dating from 1260 to 1390. And every single shroud skeptic who's read the peer-reviewed papers, including in Oxford University, Oxford Radiocarbon Labs, one of the labs that dated the shroud, even they admitted their results were bunk, and that basically you can't rely on it to say that the shroud actually dates from 1260 to 1390. And this was published in the academic secular scientific peer-reviewed journal, Archaeometry, from Oxford University. Does this guy know about it? Clueless.
Peer-reviewed studies on the Shroud of Turin suggest that it cannot be dated earlier than the late 13th century. But sure, let's say that the shroud actually is 2,000 years old. That doesn't mean that it's Jesus's burial shroud or that the image that's on the shroud was produced magically. But let's be real here. The shroud simply cannot be dated to the 1st century of
Yes, it can.
the Common Era. But even if we could, it proves nothing about the death or even the resurrection of Jesus.
And based on my biblical scholarship, I can assure you that no one was crucified the way Jesus of Nazareth was crucified.
Bullshit. Oh, give me that good old apologetics.
Are you all right, skeptic? Oh my gosh, what are you all hopped up on crack cocaine or something like that? Name a single person in all of human history who is known to have undergone the unique wounds of Jesus Christ of ancient Nazareth in terms of the crown of thorns, scourge wounds, chest wound, and crucifixion. Not a single peep.
The Institute of Crystallography in Italy has confirmed using wide-angle X-ray scattering technology that the Shroud of Turin, which again is currently in Italy, but is indeed 2,000 years old. We believe it to be the very burial cloths of Jesus of Nazareth.
All right. This is going to be kind of a scientifically intense section here, so bear with me, okay? First, we have to ask what the Waxis method is and why is it even being used here? Waxis, or wide-angle X-ray scattering, bombards materials with X-rays to study the structural degradation of cellulose. In this case, it would be linen fibers. The idea is that over time, the molecular structure is going to degrade in a predictable way, and this lets scientists estimate the age of the material. Now, the next question is, why is this even being used on the shroud? Using the Waxis method on the shroud presents a number of issues. The method itself is going to require whatever material you're studying to be housed in a climate-controlled area. The method itself is going to require stable storage conditions in order to render an accurate date. Since the technique estimates age based on structural degradation, this should be the first red flag whenever you hear about a Waxis study being done on the Shroud of Turin, unless you're a deeply biased person that really wants the resurrection to be a real historical event. Then you're just not even going to worry about critical thinking. Study's conclusions also had a number of issues themselves. First of all, it doesn't even get the dating correct. First, the Waxis dates the shroud to around 55 to 74 CE, which is at least 22 years past the time when Jesus supposedly died. But in their conclusion, the researchers said that the structural degradation of the shroud matches a 2,000-year-old time frame. So not strictly the 55 to 74 CE dating that they get from the Waxis waxis method, meaning that they did the actual study, looked at the findings, and was like, yeah, that's close enough. But these scientists are basically adding on speculation to the waxis results in order to get an earlier date. I don't know about y'all, but I feel like that is yet another red flag, and also not how science is done. If we compare this to the 1988 radiocarbon study, all three of the independent labs dated to the same time frame. Do you notice the big difference in quality here? Nobody has to add speculation onto the 1988 study, but you got to add speculation and ad hoc conclusions onto this whole waxis study.
All right, so I'm going to pause this shroud skeptic here and kind of take him to task a little bit. Now, here's a treat. So I'm not going to just give a reaction on this, because on the waxis thing, he appeals to the waxis and the carbon-14 dating. So on the waxis thing, I'm going to give my presentation, because I was did a debate with another shroud skeptic who I had a lot more respect for than this arrogant, godless engineer. But Evil Mike, the Evil Christianity host, was kind enough to host me on his channel, and we had a great discussion and a debate. It wasn't as formal as I was expecting it to be, but I prepared. It was on the waxis versus carbon-14 dating. So Godless Engineer here talks about the waxis. So I want to give my presentation and show my PowerPoint slides for that, because in the show with Evil Christianity, there was a technical glitch so that my slides didn't actually show when I gave my presentation. So I'm going to give it right here and right now to educate beloved Godless here. All right, so Shroud Wars debate, carbon-14 versus the wax. So my opening was on the wax. So in the early 2010s, frustrated with the inability to do further carbon-14 tests on the Shroud of Turin due to its inherently destructive nature, Giulio Fonte was looking to develop new non-destructive dating techniques to date the Shroud. Now, before developing a new dating technique, he had to come up with a list of about 7 to 10 scientific criteria for coming up with a reliable dating technique. Here they are listed below. 7 of them. 1. Identify suitable and in samples of known age and varying antiquity. 2. Screen the samples to ensure there are no irregularities. In other words, that the degradation would be due to the natural aging process alone. 3. Identify measurable age-dependent characteristics. 4. Obtain measurements of these characteristics from all suitable samples and use them to calibrate a formula for calculating age. 5. Perform a statistical check to test the formula's accuracy. 6. Assess the level of uncertainty. 7. Determine the effect of the 1532 Chambéry fire on the measurement. So these were the scientific criteria they used in coming up with various methods. And originally, Fonte and his team came up with 3 different physics-based dating techniques. So based on differing ways to that linen reliably or predictably degrades over time due to natural aging. So the first 3 techniques include the FTIR, Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy dating, and the mechanical tensile strength of the fibers or fibrils. And using these 3 techniques in around 2015, he got the following results. So you can see here that they obtained a date of 80 AD plus or minus 200 years with a 95% degree of certainty that the Shroud dates. The only period that these techniques all overlap is the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus Christ in 30 AD. Incredible. Does this skeptic know about it? He's totally ignorant. All he knows about is wax, and wax isn't included here. So let's start talking about the wax. Okay, so the wax dating technique came in later on in 2019. And in November of that year, world's expert in X-rays, scattering technique, Dr. Liberato De Caro, teamed up with Giulio Fonte and other scientists and invented a brand new dating technique known as the waxis dating technique that can be used to date ancient linen textiles. It was published in the paper right here, X-ray Dating of Ancient Linen Fabrics. And this was in the secular peer-reviewed science journal, Heritage. You can read for free on my website. And it has nothing to do with dating the Shroud of Turin at all. Totally just independently dating a dozen samples of known age, over a dozen samples of known age. And basically what it does is using wide-angle X-ray scattering, They irradiated the samples of linen with a beam of X-rays, and by doing this, it produces a detectable scatter pattern with intensity peaks. And the intensity peaks are what are crucial for understanding the details of the crystalline structure present in it. And basically, by testing the crystalline structure of these cloths, of the samples of linen, they discovered that the cellulose in linen becomes less crystalline over time. And in turn, this reduces the intensity of the scatter intensity peaks due to the depolymerization of the cellulose. So this gives you a way to date things because it predictably, through natural aging, decreases in a reliable way over time. Now, from this, a theoretical calibration formula was derived for dating the linen samples directly from wide-angle X-ray scattering measurements. And their preliminary results show that X-ray dating results are reliably in agreement with other dating sources. So they tested all these cloths and they got the right age using this technique, so long as certain conditions were satisfied. So there were two that they outline in the 2019 paper. First, you can't use it to date textiles older than 3,000 years old because the saturation of the crystalline structure degradation can't get any worse after 3,000 years. So you can't date things older than 1000 BC or thereabouts. But secondly, and this is more importantly, the application can be only conducted on textiles whose cellulose degradation is mainly due to natural aging arising from thermal, hydrolytic, photolytic, photochemical, and oxidative processes at approximately room temperature and average humidity conditions. So this was the condition that two conditions. They assumed room temperature and humidity conditions. In April of 2022, they applied the wax dating technique independently established back in 2019, 2 years earlier, to the Shroud of Turin. Dr. DeCaro, Fonte, and the other scientists applied this groundbreaking wax dating technique to the Shroud of Turin in their paper, X-ray Dating of a Turin Shroud's Linen Sample. And this is the paper that all the ignorant Fundile Shroud skeptics online talk about and appeal to. This is the paper that made the headlines in the secular peer-reviewed science journal Heritage. Now, the X-ray dating method was applied to a sample of the Turin Shroud consisting of a thread taken in proximity to the 1988 carbon-14 dating area of the shroud on that lower corner. And when they used the wax technique, the integrated data profiles for the Turin Shroud sample were fully compatible with analogous measurements obtained on a linen sample from a cloth from the siege of Masada, dating between 55 to 74 AD. Incredible. And here's their actual results. This is the actual results. Here are the intensity peaks on the right-hand side. This is what's relevant for the actual dating part. And you can see the orange is the shroud and the green is the Masada sample. And right here, they overlap perfectly, dating to the 1st century. And this graph is representing the raw wax profile. This is raw data. This is not used with calculations using human bias or human assumptions or something like that. This is the raw scientific empirical data itself showing this remarkable overlap with a cloth from the 1st century and not fitting more recent cloths like the black line, which was a modern thing, or a medieval cloth, which is represented by the red line, 575 AD. This is incredible, folks. Incredible confirmation. The shroud is 1st century. Only a fool who denies his own eyeballs could deny that these are not overlapping and therefore date to the same 1st century date. They tested the effects of thermal shock on the linen. And this was to account for the fact that the shroud was in 1532. It was in a major fire where silver was melted. It was so hot and burned right through the Shroud of Turin. So they basically tested the wax patterns before and after a thermal treatment in the oven of a linen piece of temperature at 200 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes. And they showed that the basically had zero effect. Not zero, but it had very minor effect, 0.6% of effect in terms of aging the shroud. Now you might say, well, why 200 degrees Celsius? If it was hot, the fire was hot enough to melt silver, it's probably like 900 degrees Celsius or 1200, whatever the temperature is to melt silver, which is really a lot higher than 200 degrees Celsius. Now, the thing is, we know for an empirical fact that the Shroud of Turin was not subject to temperatures other than the burn areas, because Dr. Ray Rogers has done various microchemical tests proving the shroud was not subject to temperatures higher than that. And if it were, then the images on the Shroud of Turin, the damage to the crystalline structure would have been such that the shroud images would no longer be visible. Thus, at maximum, it could only have been subject to temperatures of 200 degrees Celsius or less. What's more, the Shroud of Turin does not fluoresce under ultraviolet illumination, bright red, as happens with very hot scorches, so that the shroud skeptics are assuming the shroud was privy to during the 1532 fire. In fact, the scorch wounds where the silver fell onto the shroud and burned right through the cloth, those do fluoresce bright red under ultraviolet fluorescence spectral tests. But the rest of the shroud does not, proving it was not subject to temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius. Incredible. Empirical proof. The shroud skeptics are full of it. Now, the experimental results are, it's not only the fact that the shroud images were proven to be compatible with first century linen cloths, but it was also proven beyond all reasonable doubt that the experimental results proved the Shroud of Turin is incompatible. It's scientifically impossible for the shroud to have a medieval origin. And that is incredible. So there are two claims in this paper. One, the shroud is most consistent, and therefore probably a first century cloth. Secondly, it's impossible to be a medieval cloth. So even if it's not first century, let's say hypothetically or something like that, it's impossible for it to be a medieval cloth. It is centuries old. It is centuries older than a medieval textile. Now, this is under the condition that it was kept at suitable levels of average secular temperature, so between 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius, and a correlated relative humidity between 75 to 55% for the 13 centuries of its unknown history prior to the 7 centuries of its uncontroversial history. Shouldn't be known and unknown, because we know the shroud dated prior to the 700 years ago. We know that for a fact with actual proof as to where it was historically. But nonetheless, in terms of the uncontroversial versus controversial history. So there's 13 centuries of its controversial history. They made this assumption about the temperature and humidity. And interestingly, a detail often overlooked by shroud skeptics is the simple fact that regardless of whether or not the wax dating results place the shroud's origin in the first century, and whether that's valid or not, the results proved conclusively beyond all reasonable doubt that it is physically impossible for the shroud to date the medieval period. Unless you want to posit that aliens came and took the shroud to some alien planet or something. If it was on the planet Earth, it's physically impossible for that shroud to be medieval. Incredible, folks. Now, the analysis showed from the known history of the shroud of the 14th century until today, so meaning the uncontroversial history, that the natural aging of the cellulose has been very low due to the known secular European average room temperatures. This showed that the European secular average room temperature is much colder, being around 8.5 to 9 degrees Celsius, thereby preventing the Turin shroud's body image from fully disappearing, which would have happened only after 700 years at an average secular room temperature of 22.5 to 23 degrees Celsius. So if it was in hotter climates, just for 700 years, the images would have vanished. However, in order for the shroud to have obtained the same wax spectra data that it got during this dating test, and still only to be 700 years old, as per the shroud skeptics, then this would entail that the shroud was held in an environment with a minimum average temperature of 27.5 degrees Celsius, which is totally inconsistent with its known European provenance over the 700 years. It could not have originated in Liry, France, and just been with the uncontroversial history. Because again, the average temperatures there are 8.5 to 9 degrees Celsius in Europe. But we know for a fact from the wax data, it must have been present with to average temperatures 27.5 minimally. What's more is that even if the above were somehow possible to be true, then the images would have completely disappeared from being seen with the naked eye long before the 20th and 21st centuries, yet we still see them today. This simple consideration seems to exclude the hypothesis that the Turin Shroud is much less than 20 centuries old. Incredible. So even if you don't buy the raw data proving the shroud is from the 1st century, you have to say, well, it's not much older than that. It's maybe 2nd century at the latest, kind of thing. And that, at least that 1st and 2nd century, is proven beyond all reasonable doubt. Scientifically impossible for the shroud to be medieval or any of the preceding centuries, apart from the 1st or 2nd centuries, based on the empirical observational data that everybody admits. Incredible, folks. All right. Now here's the third paper from September of 2022 that shroud skeptics like Godless Engineer are totally ignorant of. They're clueless. They're mindless. They're dumb. They've never even heard of this paper. And it's because it's not up there in the pop culture. People like Cameron Bertuzzi's of the world or the other popularizing pro-shroud experts who get all the views and attention and stuff like that, they never mention this paper. And it's called Long-Term Temperature Effects on the Natural Linen Aging of the Turin Shroud, published in the secular peer-reviewed science journal Information. And this totally destroys the shroud skeptics like Godless Engineer over here who claim, oh, well, you need to assume average temperatures of 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius and average relative humidity. Those assumptions are wrong if it's in Europe. Oh, shroud skeptic, man, you're mindless. Now, this paper corrects for that. We no longer make that assumption, and we can still prove the shroud is 1st century. Incredible. In this third paper here, the experimental results of the first study on the shroud supported the hypothesis that the shroud is 2,000 years old under the condition that it was kept for 13 centuries during its controversial history at an average secular temperature 20 to 22.5 degrees Celsius and a relative humidity in the range of 55 to 75%. However, scientists admit that the shroud was probably not kept in a tomb for centuries, where the mean temperatures and relative humidity are more similar to secular averages. Thus, in September 2022, a more realistic, plausible accounting for the shroud's proposed history was required, and they did that to refine and produce more accurate calculations. The purpose of the third paper is to estimate the natural aging of the shroud in the year 2021 using the known monthly mean temperatures in degrees Celsius, and relative humidity of each of the localities indicated, assuming a 2,000-year existence, and then comparing this prediction with the actual 2021 wax measurements. They did this by considering 4 different alleged historical paths based on the actual historical evidence from shroud experts. So for example, there are some people who say the shroud went from Jerusalem to Beirut to Constantinople and then finally on to France, where we have its known uncontroversial history. Others, like my friend Jack Markwart, saying it went from Jerusalem to Antioch, on to Constantinople, and onwards. Others that say the shroud went from Jerusalem to Edessa, from Edessa to Constantinople, and then onwards to Europe, with its uncontroversial history and that sort of thing. And they tested these 4 different paths with their known monthly mean temperatures and relative humidity to those localities, and actually showed that the Shroud of Turin is most likely Jerusalem Beirut or Jerusalem Antioch, as per Jack Markwart, and then through Constantinople history. This is more calibrated and more refined calculation, and it actually gives us a hint as to where the shroud was located, and it speaks against the image of Edessa hypothesis. So this proves that the Shroud of Turin must have been in the Middle East for a period of its history, for centuries of its history, before arriving in Constantinople and then moving on to Europe. This study was incredible, and it totally takes away the Shroud's skeptical objection that the wax only works if you make assumptions that it's an average temperature and relative humidity. I guess it's failed. Oh my goodness. Well, thanks to this September 2022 paper, the Shroud Skeptics Objection in the garbage. Educate yourself, godless engineer. You must be ashamed of how ignorant you sound when you said what you said. Yeah, look, the wax conclusions, the wax dating technique was tested and calibrated using samples of known age and proven to reliably date these linen textiles accurately in 2019. Had nothing to do with the Shroud of Turin. In April 2022, the paper conclusively ruled out a medieval date for the Shroud. The April 2022 paper demonstrated that the Shroud is most likely much older and is most consistent with the wax profile of a 1st century Masada cloth dating between 55 and 74 AD. Thus, the Shroud is very probably a 1st century cloth. The September 2022 paper further refined these calculations and adjusted for the average temperature and humidity assumptions from the prior paper in April. And instead, they used more realistic monthly temperature and relative humidity values, relative with respect to the specific proposed localities, given the historical evidence for its pre-medieval history. And these were smoothed to account for indoor versus outdoor variations. They assumed, obviously, it would be more, the Shroud would have been kept as a religious relic indoors rather than outdoors most of the time. And to calibrate their findings according to these 4 possible historical geographical paths proposed for the Shroud's history from Jerusalem through to Turin, Italy, over 20 centuries. Most likely path the Shroud has traveled based on the wax data was from Jerusalem to Beirut, or perhaps Antioch, to Constantinople, to Liri, France, and then on to Turin, Italy, where it is to this day. Now, what about some objections Shroud skeptics like my evil Christianity raised, but also that godless engineer raised here? Let me go to my response. So the first is they say, well, the wax, Dr. Liberato de Caro is a fraud because, look, he published in a paper in 2017. That paper was retracted using wax to prove there's blood. Okay, my first response is, so what? This is totally irrelevant. If one paper was retracted due to a technicality, that has nothing to do with whether Dr. de Caro is a good scientist, nor does it have any bearing whatsoever on whether the substantive work and research done on the wax dating of the Shroud is valid or not. In Dr. de Caro's own words, quote unquote, let us also note that the 2017 paper contains no X-ray dating of any Shroud sample, because the theory for this new dating method was developed in 2019 and applied to the Shroud of Turin sample only later and published in 2 articles of 2022. Furthermore, in terms of the retraction itself, the reasons for the retraction were biased and dumb, as Dr. de Caro points out. For example, the sample analyzed in our work was only one from the very beginning, before the peer review process. For the 3 reviewers and the editor before the peer review process, this was no problem. Heritage, the Plus One journal, published the paper knowing in advance they only tested 1 sample and that was sufficient scientifically for the conclusions reached. But why, when it was objected to, did this, oh, well, this was a reason why we're retracting it because you only dated 1 sample? Well, why publish it in the first place if these are so-called scientists? Why did the editor only realize this after the publication of the work? Very strange. It seems to me rather that we are faced with a case of scientific ostracism. In other words, dumb, Satan-induced, stupid bias. Shroud skeptical bias. That's it. Next, not only did the journal editors hide basically Dr. de Caro's response to the retraction, because in peer review, the peer review process is if they retract your paper, they have to give the reasons, which they did on their website. All right, so here's the 2017 paper, Atomic Resolution Studies Detect New Biologic Evidences on the Turin Shroud, and you can see retraction with their response, the editor's reasons as to why they responded. Now, Liberato de Caro and Giulio Fonte responded to this, But instead of putting the response on the front page as per the peer-reviewed protocol, they hid it in the comments. And look at this, comments are temporarily unavailable. They're even hiding the comments now. But Dr. DeCaro gave a detailed response refuting every single reason given for the retraction in the main article, and absolutely obliterated and refuted them. Now, unfortunately, the editor did not respond to this refutation as per the peer review process. As Dr. DeCaro says, look, please note that the +1 editor's answer to our reply to the retraction, our refutation of their retraction, is still missing, and we are still waiting for the reply. Therefore, as per the rules of peer reviewing, the results discussed in the paper of 2017 are still fully valid. They are not, technically speaking, retracted. Until now, there is no +1 editor's reply to our criticisms to the retraction, meaning skeptics saying the 2017 paper has been retracted is wrong. This is a lie. It's, despite what it says on the website, it's not retracted because Liberato DeCaro refuted the reasons for retraction. And unless the editor responds to the refutations, technically speaking, it is not retracted. So that's the first response on the 2017 thing. Next, the Heritage Journal is whack. This is a predatory journal and that sort of thing. Well, here's Dr. DeCaro refuting this. He says, quote unquote, Heritage is in the Web of Science database. The journal has an impact factor of 2.0 as of 2023, which is, it's not the highest in the world. There are journals with like Nature and stuff that have much higher journal impact factors, but this journal impact factor of 2.0 is very high. It's a very high rating in this nuanced field of study specifically. And if you look up how these rankings of journal impact factors work, you'll see that it's relative to the specific field. And a 2.0 within this field that Dr. DeCaro specializes in, the wax dating and using wax technique, instruments and stuff like that, this is a very high rating. Its ranking of Q1, conservation, Q2, multidisciplinary science, the aims and scope of the journal are fully matched to the studies concerning dating of ancient textiles, like the Shroud of Turin. For this reason, it is possible to find articles concerning the Turin Shroud just published on Heritage. Overall, very high impact factors are quite rare, with most journals having impact factors below 2. What one field considers a high impact factor may not be the same in another field, so publication patterns vary significantly between the fields. For example, fields with the overall lower impact factors may publish papers that have longer lasting relevance and will spread citations out over more years. Or fields with a smaller researcher community will have less articles published each year and may therefore have less citations per paper as a result. So, yeah, I think it's provides good context in terms of why the journal Heritage was selected for this specific field. Next, Dr. DeCaro is a loon. So the evil Christianity, my debate interlocutor, he mentioned this. And I just wanted to say, in terms of Dr. DeCaro, this is out of sheer skeptical bias. So denouncing Dr. DeCaro as a pro-shroud loon is demonstrably false and is literally nothing more than logically fallacious ad hom reasoning. Dr. DeCaro has over 30 years of direct experience in the research fields of X-ray scattering and electron diffraction specifically, confirmed by dozens upon hundreds of research peer-reviewed secular scientific journals, including several in the top science journal in the world, Nature. Here's an extensive list or catalog of his various papers. So look at this, Dr. Liberato DeCaro. Oh my goodness, look at these things, right? And including right here in Applied Crystallography, probably the top journal in his specific field. Not only that, look at this, the journal Nature. He's got several publications in the journal Nature and all sorts of secular peer-reviewed science journals having nothing to do with religion or the Shroud of Turin or anything like that. This guy is a world's expert. And I remember it just keeps going and going. He's got over 100 at the very least, and maybe hundreds. I just kind of gave up on searching. But yeah, look at all these papers from Dr. Liberato De Caro. Yes, calling this guy a loon or a shroudy is just kind of ignorant. I believe him. I don't believe a godless engineer. Sorry. Okay, in terms of the 1532 fire damage, as I said, this was directly taken into account in the 2022 papers. So against this dating, it could be argued that the shroud has not only suffered natural aging, but also the effects of the fire, 1532. This fire's possible effect on the cellulose degradation was discussed and assessed in 2019. It is known that the increase in temperature accelerates the depolymerization rate, but it does so only for a few minutes because the associated reduction in relative humidity slows and almost stops the depolymerization. And this was verified in the laboratory itself. Since linen is a poor heat conductor, it has been excluded that the sample used for the wax dating was subjected to high temperatures because it was located far from the burned areas, and the still bright color of the linen thread demonstrates the absence of exposure to temperatures greater than 200 degrees Celsius. After the use of water to stop the fire of 1532, within a few seconds, the temperature of the linen was already below 100 degrees Celsius. And in another few minutes, the linen's temperature reached a few degrees above room temperature. Even if the relative humidity had remained at 100% for weeks, its effect on linen degradation would have been very limited. Indeed, the theoretical formula developed allows us to conclude that 30 minutes at 100% relative humidity and 100 degrees Celsius temperatures would have increased the degree of aging by only 0.6%. Pitiful, nothing, a drop in the bucket. In addition, a full year at 100% relative humidity and room temperature would have increased the degree of aging by less than 0.1%. Incredible. Thus, the increment of the aging is in both cases negligible because a degree of aging of 60% plus or minus 2% has been measured on the shroud sample directly. So the fire damage or even any and all posited fire damage over the controversial portions of the shroud's history would do bupkis to change the results. What about other forms of damage? Well, other causes, such as the presence of possible catalysts, acids, bases, the activity of microorganisms, etc., these can all cause an increment in the natural aging of a textile. However, most of these agents induce changes in the external appearance of linen that are very readily empirically observable, even with the naked eye. And Dr. Ray Rogers inspected the shroud thoroughly in 1978 and later observed fibers from the shroud under the microscope, along with Dr. Walter McCroney, who ruled out all of these hypothetical agents as playing a role. In particular, the sample of the shroud analyzed by wax to date the fabric was looked at through an optical microscope and did not show any evident deterioration due to chemical action, mechanical friction, autocatalytic decomposition, microbiological attack, or fire damage. Incredible, folks. Finally, the shroud's exposure to sunlight can be assumed to have been limited during eventual religious processions, whose duration can be surely neglected with respect to the timescale of many centuries. A year lasts 9,000 hours, for example, and a religious procession lasts but a few hours within that year. We're talking less than 1% here, folks. Therefore, the direct contribution of cellulose degradation due to direct sunlight can also be considered negligible with respect to the shroud's natural aging over the many centuries. And again, had the shroud been exposed during its unknown or controversial history to sunlight over periods, long centuries of time or something like that, the images would not be visible today. The cellulose would have degraded to the point where we could not see with our naked eyes the shroud images at all. So clearly it was not subject to long periods of time out in the sun. The next thing, indoor versus outdoor temperatures. So they assumed indoors, right? So basically fabrics like the shroud are usually kept indoors. Therefore, they're only slightly affected by outdoor temperatures. And it can be noted that the indoor temperature changes much less than the outdoor temperatures, both hourly and on a daily basis, and the fluctuations is quite less. So it has this smoothing effect on the temperature variations. Okay, so the final substantive objection. Even if we accept the wax date and that the shroud is first century, it's consistent with the cloth that dates from 55 to 74 AD. That's too late for Jesus, who died in 30 AD or 33 AD, depending on when you date it. So this is too late. Here's a answer from Giulio Fonte, more directly relevant to, well, if it's 55 to 74 AD, that's too late. Giulio Fonte says, as for your doubt about the X-ray dating, if I understood correctly, it is that this would lead to a date at the end of the first century or the second one, therefore not of 33 AD. This is a banality because I do not know of a dating method, including carbon-14, that is not correlated to an uncertainty of measurement. In the paper with Dr. DeCaro, Giulio Fonte, had expressly asked for this to be in uncertainty range or measurement to be indicated, but the group preferred to omit it. As you can see from the results of other mechanical and chemical dating, the uncertainty is of a few centuries. In our case, not yet standardized as an X-ray measurement, an uncertainty of about plus or minus 300 years could be assigned, so the results should be revised to be about 200 BC plus to 400 AD. Incredible, folks. So 55 to 74 AD plus or minus 300 years. I don't know about you, but I'm good enough at math to go, yeah, that 30 to 33 AD is included in that plus or minus 300 years. Perfectly consistent. Incredible, folks. Incredible. So that's my take on the wax dating technique. And I'm glad I got to share my slides that for my debate with Evil Christianity that I didn't get to show because of that technical glitch. I read them, but I didn't get to show the slides. Again, these slides will be on my blog, so if you want to check them out for yourselves. I also had a rebuttal section to the carbon-14. I know he mentioned carbon-14, but I'm going to get back to the reaction video. And if he mentions carbon-14 again, I'll get into my rebuttal slides.
The math isn't mathing on this particular conclusion here. The study was conducted in 2022, and if the linen is 2,000 years old, that would place it about 11 years before Jesus was supposedly crucified, at least the date that Dr. Jeremiah Johnston gives. But I do feel like this entire conversation is rendered moot when you consider the fact that the Waxis study automatically assumes that the shroud was stored between 20 and 22.5 degrees Celsius for 13 fucking centuries that we have no historical data about. That's how they get their 2,000 year estimate.
Yeah, educate yourself, skeptic. I just read the slide to you addressing that objection, and you're wrong.
Now, the actual medieval storage conditions, which would have been in a cooler and drier climate, would render this timeline invalid. If the recorded conditions that we have invalidate the timeline, then that makes this entire endeavor pointless. There's no way to know how old the shroud is using wide-angle X-ray scattering. Now, here's something that we do know about the shroud that plays into the 1988 radiocarbon dating and the historical record for the Shroud of Turin. And that's the herringbone weave. It's a 3-to-1 twill weave. And this is the weave that is found in the Shroud of Turin. What's interesting about this is that this particular weave is absent from the historical record of first century Jewish shrouds that were used in burials. They typically employed simpler plain weaves. The Hungarian Prey manuscript, which is generally dated between 1180 and 1190 CE, also uses the herringbone weave. This suggests medieval origins for the Shroud of Turin.
It's true. Most people were poor, and most people were buried in their tunics and stuff like that. Now, we only have one single archaeological find of a Jewish burial shroud. You can't make the logically fallacious overgeneralization or hasty generalization from one archaeological finding like Dr. James Daber does, apparently godless engineer, without critical thinking, mindlessly does himself, like a fool, and just assume, oh, duh, all shrouds were like this. Oh, yeah. You can't do that, skeptic. You've got to use your brain and you've got to think for a change. I know it's hard, but you got to think before you speak. Everybody with a PhD knows. Textile experts like Dr. Ada Grossi or Diana Fulbright and stuff like that, they proven, absolute proof. The shroud is perfectly consistent with a first century rich cloth. And perhaps this cloth was used in the temple itself, as Ada Grossi mentions, and that's how the rich Joseph of Arimathea got a hold of it, because of a defect with this side strip. It was basically cut too short. They had to re-sew on in the manufacturing plant, re-sew on part of the thing, and that meant it was imperfect for temple service, and that's probably why they sold it to the rich Joseph of Arimathea, and he used it in haste as a burial cloth to bury Christ in. You have no idea what you're talking about. We have way more complicated weaves dating hundreds or even thousands of years before the first century AD. There's nothing about a herringbone 3-to-1 herringbone twill pattern that rules out a first century AD date. Check out my show on the textile evidences, where I go into exquisite detail refuting this nonsense from the skeptic here.
88 radiocarbon dating study that was done on the Shroud of Turin included 3 independent labs from Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona, and they confirmed the medieval date between 1260 and 1390 CE. This radiocarbon study is one of the most widely cited studies concerning the shroud. So, Dr. Jeremiah Johnston is laying out a whole bunch of apologetic bullshit right here up front.
All right, so the godless engineer sticks his foot in the mouth, as per usual, by mentioning the carbon-14 dating. So this is, again, my rebuttal. I was supposed to have a 10-minute rebuttal with evil Christianity in my Shroud Wars debate. So here's my rebuttal on the 1988 carbon-14 dating. Basically, I'm going to provide some undercutting defeaters where I'm undermining the justification for this godless engineer to believe the shroud is actually medieval based on the proven erroneous carbon-14 dating results. And one rebutting defeater where I can say I can prove that the facts contradict the medieval origin of the shroud. Incredible, folks. Let's get to it. So basically, undercutting defeater number 1 is saying that there's a conspiracy theory, right? It's equally probable there's a conspiracy. Can the godless engineer absolutely prove that a conspiracy did not take place? Because there were certain protocols which were not followed. So, for example, this was all supposed to be on video camera. Unfortunately, Michael Tite, along with another, took the samples backstage off camera and put them into their vials labeled with numbers and that sort of thing. And then he came back out. Can Godless Engineer prove that they didn't swap out the shroud with a known medieval fabric for carbon-14 dating? Are we just going to mindlessly beg the question and assume that, oh, well, the shroud skeptics can be trusted. They're not biased, right? Oh, they wouldn't cheat like that. Prove it, skeptic. Godless Engineer, prove it. Prove they did not swap out the samples. If you have no reasons, just your bias and your wishful thinking of, well, this proved that the shroud's medieval, and that's what I want to hear, so therefore we can just assume they didn't engage in fraud. No, you have to prove that it's improbable that they committed fraud. You can't just assume it. And I don't believe that I can prove. I have a reason to think that it is improbable that this conspiracy theory happened, the switcheroo theory. I don't believe it myself as a pro-shroud proponent. But I don't grant that to you as a skeptic. This is a debate, and while this was meant to be for a debate, it's up to you to meet your burden of proof, skeptic. What reason do you have to think that the old switcheroo did not take place? And if you've got no reason other than your bias, that's not good enough. Secondly, it was supposed to be a blind testing. It wasn't. They labeled each of the cloths. And Michael Tite just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, shucks, there's no point in doing a blind test because, what's the point? There was an unusual weaving in the shroud. They would have known anyways. No, we agreed to a blind testing. You follow through. It's not your place to make that judgment against the carbon-14 scientists wanting a blind test. And as for going backstage, he basically just said, well, yeah, you're right. That was quite unnecessary. I shouldn't have done that. AMS carbon-14 has been proven to be unreliable for dating textiles like the shroud at the time in the 1980s. And this was proven through various intercomparison tests, such as 4 AMS labs in 1986 being tested. The results were found to be inconsistent with the historically derived date of the known sample from 1200 AD, but they were all consistently wrong, just like what happened with the Shroud of Turin. Another intercomparison test in 1990 showed that 2 out of 5 AMS labs failed the systematic bias criterion. Very interesting, systematic bias. Remember that. So they only had a 60% success rate. That's pathetic. And that's what caused secular, non-Christian, non-Shroudist Dr. Murdoch Baxter, carbon-14 world's expert, director of the Scottish University's Research and Reactor Centre, East Kilbride, to proclaim the margin of error with AMS carbon-14 dating seems to be as much as 2 to 3 times as great as practitioners of the technique have claimed. Of the 38 labs investigated, only 7 produced results that the organizers of the trial considered to be satisfactory. It is now clear that the other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analyzing of the samples. The AMS labs in particular were way out, even when dating samples as little as 200 years old. That's called being pathetic. And I've got a couple other quotes from Dr. Lloyd Curry and Christopher Ramsey saying, again, undermining the reliability of the AMS carbon-14 for dating the Shroud of Turin. I also appeal to the sample was unrepresentative. I didn't get into this in the debate due to lack of time. But yeah, I was going to ask him, what about these findings proving, empirical findings suggesting that the Shroud sample was unrepresentative to the rest of the cloth? And here's the picture of the blue quad mosaic, one of the findings. Next, I get into the final thing, fudged statistics, which is the Tristan Casabianca paper, proving that basically there's a gradient or slope of all 16 subsamples, revealing a slope of 36 years per centimeter. And that means you don't have a 95% degree of confidence because there's a 98.6% probability of a systematic bias or error. Remember that earlier intercomparison tests showed that the AMS labs sucked when it came to dealing with systematic bias issues. 2 out of the 5 labs failed that criterion. So it's easy to see why all 3 labs could easily have failed when you're only testing 3 measly labs. You should have had way more labs like the original 7 that Stirp proposed originally. It would help factor out those systematic bias errors, perhaps. But what is the nature of this systematic bias? What's causing this problem? And on this front, we have different, at least 2 or more equally probable suggestions. One is which is consistent with the medieval date. There was a difference in cleaning procedure, and they didn't clean all the gunk off from one of the labs, and that's why there were outliers. The other is supernatural neutron irradiation during Jesus' resurrection in 30 AD made the cloth date to the medieval period, as we saw. Which one is true? Empirically, they're both equivalent. We just have no way to tell. So here's just showing it and stuff like that. Here's the paper. Here are all 16 subsamples. Here's the slope of 36, the gradient of the shroud getting younger by 36 years. For every centimeter you date from the edge of the cloth going towards the center of the cloth. Bob Rucker used the MCMP computer calculations to calculate how the neutrons would have affected the carbon-14 dates. This is where the carbon-14 dating, getting it around the 1260 to 1390 AD date. If they dated in the middle, they would have got 8500 AD in the middle from the carbon-14 dates. But remember I said, well, how do we prove? We don't know what is the cause of the systematic bias. Now we do. We have empirical proof from physicist Dr. Tom McAvoy, who discovered that neutron irradiation is influenced by ultraviolet fluorescence. But ultraviolet fluorescence intensity levels are affected by neutron radiation. And guess what he found? Published in the secular peer-reviewed science journal, Applied Optics. There's a direct, precise correlation between Bob Rucker's MCMP computer calculations based on the assumed neutron irradiation from a supernatural resurrection event with Jesus in 30 AD. Again, they made that assumption, and this is what he got based on his computer calculations. Here's where the shroud was dated, around 1200 to 1300s. Guess what? Independently, the ultraviolet fluorescence intensity peaks proven by Stirp in 1978 precisely match that curve. What does that prove? It proves the shroud was neutron irradiated, and thus that's the answer for consistently with Bob's neutron irradiation hypothesis, proving that shroud was dating to 30 AD and was neutron irradiated, and it precisely the way Bob Rucker and his hypothesis posit. And it's now been empirically proven on a balance of probabilities through Dr. Tom McAvoy's findings, independent findings of the ultraviolet fluorescence intensity peaks. Incredible, folks. So the shroud skeptics are wrong.
We do indeed have a 2,000-year-old burial shroud. Now, why do we believe it's Jesus? Raj, unlike other burial shrouds, and we have many of them that we have discovered from the land of Israel. Think about Lazarus. He's buried in a burial shroud in John chapter 11 when Jesus raises him from the dead. The unique thing about the Shroud of Turin, which is fascinating, is there is an image that is superficially embedded in the 14-foot long burial cloth of the front and back of a 5'11" man, Jewish man with a beard who has experienced trauma that matches and corresponds with all of the details of Jesus's death by Roman crucifixion. And that's why we believe it is indeed the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth.
All right. So this claim, again, is scientifically intensive. So you need to hang on for a second. First of all, the logic here doesn't really make a lot of sense, but he also makes a number of historical errors. First, let's start off by assuming that this actually is an image of a 5'11" Jewish bro that was crucified by the Romans. How does Jeremiah Johnston know that this image is of the image of the Jesus that supposedly started Christianity? It could literally be any other Jewish figure that was crucified by the Romans that looks vaguely similar to how we normally depict Jesus now.
Just think about this skeptic is ludicrous. I get what he's trying to say logically, but it's stupid. It's abductively speaking, in terms of making an inference to the best explanation, it is the most foolish thing I've ever heard. So you're telling me unique wounds to only Jesus, the only person in all of human history who had this unique combination of wounds, chest wound, scourge marks, crown of thorns, and crucified. And just so happened to be proven to be miraculously leaving the shroud within a few days, leaving behind images that can't be explained by modern science. Who else would that be? It's Jesus Christ. That is the most probable explanation. You're an ignorant fool if you think that it's first century, but it's just some random, that's the shroud of Jim Bob Jones or something like that. No one, probably nobody else would have went through that unique combination of wounds and had those unique circumstances relative to them. Nobody else was injured by the ancient Romans in exactly the way Jesus was. Crown of thorns, chest wound, scourging, and crucified. Name one person we know for a fact from history who suffered that unique combination of injuries. You've got no one, skeptic. None. Zip. Bubkiss. Duda. Now, you might say, oh, well, maybe the Christians deliberately copied it and demanded the Romans and Jews crucify somebody and do the exact same things to Jesus. And the Romans just listened to them. They said, oh, okay, we're going to listen to a bunch of Jewish Christian peasants tell us how to do our job. We've been ordered to crucify Jim Bob Jones, and Jim Bob Jones happens to be a Christian, let's say, and he's asking us to, no, first scourge me, then crucify me, then give me a crown of thorns, then give me a chest wound so I can die like my Lord and Savior. And the Romans were just like, yep, we're going to do it. Highly unlikely. No, they would say, shut your mouth. We're going to do our job and crucify you. And that's it. If the shroud is first century, the best explanation, the inference to the best explanation proves it is most probably because it belonged to the historical Jesus. Only a fool could deny that, I'm sorry to say. Given the unique combination of wounds and the unique circumstances surrounding the shroud images, the formation of those images within a few days before decomposition set in and while rigor mortis was still set, and the some of the body left the shroud in a way that's at the very least suggestive, without begging the question here for the sake of argument, it's suggestive of a miraculous image forming technique that 21st century science can't explain. We're too stupid 2,000 years later to explain the images. But that's not Jesus. That's the shroud of Jim Bob Jones. Get real, skeptic. Get real.
All right, I gotta admit, I've had enough. I'm halfway through the Godless Engineers video, and I've utterly refuted all of his nonsense thus far. I think I'm just gonna call it quits here. I've watched the rest of the video. It's all just nonsense that I've refuted in my previous videos and stuff like that. So hopefully G-Hawk, as a fan request, I hope I reviewed at least half of it, and it gave me an excuse to show my slides from my debate with Evil Christianity in the earlier half of this episode. So I hope you're happy with, I at least reviewed half of Godless Engineer's supposed devastating shroud takedown and refuted his nonsense. I just don't have the stomach to sit through a bunch of more BS, nonsensical, shroud skeptical, biased claims, unsubstantiated, unproven. And they are things I've done in-depth videos on my channel refuting from the actual experts themselves and from the peer-reviewed literature, which the Godless Engineer is just totally ignorant of. So I'm just going to call it quits here for the sake of my time. But I hope you're happy with the devastating takedown I did for the first 22 minutes of the Godless Engineers video here. I just see no point in finishing off the video to the 40-minute mark at this point. Again, I've looked at the whole video, so I know he's just kind of repeating himself and bringing up the same issues over and over again, which I've already responded to here, and or I've already responded to in exquisite detail in some of my other Shroud Wars series shows. So, yeah, hope you enjoyed it, G-Hawk, but otherwise, God bless and take care, everybody.